Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me for this free mini online class, Abstract Approaches. My name is Tracy Verdugo and I am an Australian artist. I live with my husband in a small coastal village about 2.5 hours south of Sydney, and it's the most beautiful bay that we live in. It's called Jervis Bay, and a lot of my work is inspired by the beautiful surroundings here in the bay. I've put together this mini class for you, Abstract Approaches, as just a little glimpse into my teaching style and a prelude to my larger class, Abstract Mojo, which will take you on a whole bigger adventure into abstraction. So I hope that after you watch this class and try some of the exercises, that you'll join me in Abstract Mojo as well. Have fun! Hi everyone, and welcome to your first lesson in this free mini class on Abstract Approaches. I'm Tracy Verdugo, and today what we're going to be looking at is a method of working that I have come up with called embracing the contrast. Now, one of the best things about teaching, I find, is that even though I often approach my work intuitively, in order to be able to be an effective teacher and to be able to get my ideas across and help other people to understand different ways of approaching these painting techniques, I often have to sit down and dissect the way that I work within my own pieces. And so, for quite some time, students have been asking me certain questions about my abstract pieces. And I sat down one day and I realized that a lot of what I was doing is really pushing the contrast. And I don't mean just between dark and light. There are many, many ways that we can add contrasting elements to our work. And so I began to play with this idea in demonstration form at my workshops, where we would deliberately put contrasting elements against each other and move our way around a piece using contrast as our main tool to make the next move. And what I found while I was using this technique to help my students is that we were less likely to get actually into those places where we'd be stuck, where we wouldn't know what to do next. So it quickly became one of my favorite tools to use, and I'll be using it quite extensively in the upcoming Abstract Mojo course. In fact, we'll be devoting a whole week to embracing the contrast and all of the ways that we can stretch that. But what I wanted to do today is to work on 15 small pieces to just introduce you to the concept of embracing the contrast. So it's not a super expensive sheet of watercolor paper, and the reason I want you to work on just regular cartridge paper or just on some cheaper watercolor paper for this exercise is that I really want you to understand that it is an exercise. I think one of the things we get stuck on so much is this idea that everything we do has to be amazing, or that everything we do has to be, have some kind of successful outcome. When you are learning new things, whether you are learning a language, whether you are learning to cook, whether you're learning to paint, you need to give yourself permission to explore and to make mistakes and, to get rid of stuff, but just to learn while you're doing it. So you don't have to keep everything. Having said that, I'm not using like a super lightweight paper because perhaps something good will happen on one or two of the pieces and I might want to keep them and push further into them. So before we get started, let's have a look at this idea of embracing the contrast and how we can use a list of words to help us make the next move, to help us always know where to go next. So I have a list in front of me that I've come up with myself. You can actually write these ones down. You can feel free to add your own words to the list. But basically what I want to do is to create a list where we have words that either denote an emotion that we can express through art, or words that actually have an actual physical aspect. So for example, straight, as in you can do straight lines or curvy lines, etc., etc. So with this list, I've got words like straight, big, loud, expansive, transparent, contained, messy, conscious, background, cool, dark, smudged, balanced, random, complex, bright, outside, detailed, thick, loose, dry, vibrant, white, textured, and curved. Okay, so that's quite a list. So I really want you to kind of write those words down. So rewind if you need to. And then I want you to write down in your mind, what are the opposite words that come to you for all of these words that we've written down? So for example, you've written down straight, so perhaps you might write down curvy, or you might write down bent, or you might write down crooked. We'll all have kind of a slightly different approach, okay, which is fantastic, which is where we want to get to. So for example, if you've got the word messy, then, you know, for me, I might write down the word next to it, neat or contained, something like that. Smudged, the opposite to that in my mind would probably be something like clear or precise. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and you're going to write down all of the opposite words to the words that you have on this list. And we're going to use these opposites to actually move our way through the painting of all of these small pieces. Okay, so the other thing that you need to know is that I have a variety of tools and mediums beside me. Not too much because I only have a small space right here, but I have several inks, and they are Daler Rowney acrylic artists inks, and I have several acrylic heavy body paints on a small palette with some white as well. And I have just a few things that I've picked up because in order to create contrasting elements, I need to have some contrasting mediums as well, okay? So I have a couple of oil pastels, I have some charcoal, I have a few different brushes, and let's see, so I have some willow charcoal and then a heavier charcoal as well. And I also have these fun, I haven't actually played with them much, but these are Play Color Art sticks, and they're gouache solid paint sticks, and they make a great mark. So let's get started. I have no plan for this lesson at all except to follow my own prompts and to visit Embracing the Contrast on these small pieces. Now, usually I do this exercise at my workshops across one large piece, and I normally do it also on the ground. So this is going to be a little different for me, working my way across several different pieces and seeing how that pans out. So let's just take a look to get started, and I'm just going to pick one word, and the first word on my list is straight. And so I'm going to grab a piece of charcoal, and I'm just going to start at the far left and do a couple of straight lines. So the first thing that now comes into my mind is the opposite of straight, and for me that would be curvy. So I'm going to just continue that line and take it over to the next sheet. And then think about what next. So if I'm looking at both of these lines, they're actually both quite thin, yeah? So this is how my mind is working. So thin, opposite of thin would be a thicker line. So I've just taken a little bit of the charcoal and I'm going to just pull it across on its side. And as I'm doing it and it's skipping, I'm realizing that a skipping line or a dotted line is another valid way of making a mark. Or we could go for a thicker line made up by scribbling the charcoal across the page. I'm going to switch over to the heavier charcoal and just play with that. Still continuing to create line, trying to make the line just a little bit different across each one. Coming up here. Now one of the other words, I'm coming back, I'm just feeling then like, oh, okay, what shall I do next? So coming back to revisit, and the first thing I see is the word scribbly, okay? So on this one, I'm just going to come ahead and just throw in a scribbly mark right there, okay? I'm going to do the same thing on this one, but I'm going to place it in a different area, and I saw another word at the same time as I saw the word scribbly, and that word was smudged. So I'm going to just take a baby wipe and just smudge some elements of this line here. While I have the baby wipe in my hand, often I'll look at a tool that I'm using and then think to myself, well, there's still something on this tool, so perhaps I need to have a look and see what other kind of mark I can make by taking that tool and just wiping the residual off on the piece of paper. So just continuing along, let's have a look and just see. So something like if I look at the word contained, so I feel like, you know, if I did something like this with the charcoal, tiny, tiny little dots, that feels fairly contained to me. For you, it might be something completely different. If I think about the opposite of contained, suddenly I just had this kind of idea of jumping over from one sheet to the other, so escaping this contained element here. I don't really want two things to be the same, so I'm just going to take my little baby wipe again and loosen up this one here. So now we have depicted deliberate and kind of random as well, or smudgy and precise. So you see what I'm getting at here? So on the very last one, I'm just going to take the charcoal and do something different. And so now we have kind of a journey of visual elements and marks that have taken us the whole way across the 15 sheets of paper, but beginning to look at this idea of contrast. What does it mean? At a very basic, at a fundamental level, we've got contrast happening here quite easily because I've started with the black on the white paper, okay? So what's a move that we could make next? So I'm just looking down at the tools that I have in front of me, and I'm thinking that I want to try a little bit of transparency. So if we think about transparency and the opposite of transparent being opaque, it is probably best to work with something like an acrylic ink or a fluid acrylic to actually get some transparency going. And just for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to add a little ink and then take a wet, wide, flat brush and just pull that ink down. While I have the ink on my brush, I'm just going to dip a little bit into water and make a different mark So I'm going to play with the idea of transparency just using a few different coloured inks. So reaching for the Antelope Brown right now, and just in the same way feeling that the energy of these marks right now are fairly random. I'm trying to dissect this as I move along. So for example, this mark that I've made just here, this one felt like it was more organic or round, and so I've placed the transparent mark above it, kind of overlapping, but it's more of a square. So I'm thinking about this contrasting thing the whole time. Let's go for something quite dark. So this is Payne's Grey in the ink. And let's see. I'm not going to add it on this one because I already have a dark mass here. So I'm going to add the Payne's Grey to one of the pieces that feels like it doesn't yet have a lot of oomph going on. So you can see that this application of the really dark Payne's Grey has a lot of strength. And that's the thing that contrast will give you, a lot of impact. Now you can imagine that when I'm working on the flat, I have a lot more control over what the ink does. So this is new territory for me. And I actually love that. I love the fact that when I'm teaching, I try to put myself in a similar place of discomfort as my students, if that makes sense. I try to make it so that I'm not doing the same thing that I always do, where I can predictably get a good outcome. I try and put myself in the situation where things might not go quite right for me, and then I have to figure out, what do I do to solve that problem? Because that's all that creativity is, really, is just solving problems, right? So, what do I do to solve the problem of the ink running down, or do I just embrace these drips? What new thing will this bring to me? All right, just dipping that brush. There's still a bit of Payne's Grey on it, so I'm going to dip it into the water and just apply it. This one has a lot of curly, squiggly lines, so I'm going to add some straight lines. This one doesn't have a lot on it at all just yet. Maybe I'll pick up some of the Payne's Grey from here and do something quite different. So perhaps, I'm thinking, wow, I feel actually like that maybe I'm overthinking too much. So sometimes what happens when I do that is I'll just do a deliberate kind of splat mark, and just loosen things up a little bit. All right, so over on this one here, and this one here, we don't have any transparency on there yet. So this is what we were looking at as transparent at this point. So I'm going to just grab some marine blue ink and add that in. I'm not cleaning my brush completely. I have a little bit of the Payne's Grey still on there. That's actually not marine blue ink. That is Rounding Blue, which is beautiful as well. You can see how bringing the ink through the charcoal actually creates a different color, a kind of a steel blue color, which is quite beautiful. And then I'm just going to wipe the brush off in a couple of places as well. So one of the things I love to do if I have extra ink or extra paint on a piece is to work on the idea of perhaps putting in some smaller detailed elements, okay? So one of my favorite tools is a bamboo skewer, which you use for kebabs. And so I'm just going to kind of move around and see where some of the ink is still slightly wet. And I'm just going to pull it out to get some small kind of drawn elements. Which, again, if we look at the words like bold and delicate, you could see like this being quite bold and then pulling some wet ink or even, you know, dipping your skewer into the ink and adding in some small dots with the end of the bamboo skewer is bringing in something that is a little more delicate against the bolder feel of the previous marks. Whenever I have something on a tool, a little bit of ink, I make sure that I take that and use it somewhere else. Just rolling that skewer across and adding another mark to one of the sheets. Okay, so I feel like we've gotten a pretty good flow and some energy and movement beginning to happen across the whole spread of these small pieces of paper. And what I would tend to do now would be to kind of come into individual pieces and to look at the energy or the feel of the individual piece using the word list, the Embracing the Contrast word list, and then making a move that is opposite to what is on there, okay? So for example, this little piece over here feels like it is quite one-dimensional right now. It feels like it's quite flat, and so I'm going to add a little bit of texture using a stencil. And so I've just mixed up some heavy-bodied paint. Actually, we'll do it this way. Some heavy-bodied acrylic paint using Australian gold, I believe, and some white. And I'm just going to pull it across the piece, overlapping the other two elements that are already on there, which, when you do it, brings a sense of cohesion. So it's actually coming in and overlapping two separate elements and bringing those elements together. All right, so while I have the stencil in my hand, I'm going to use it in a couple of other areas. So coming over to this little one here, and the same way, pulling the stencil over a couple of the elements that are already underneath. I'm not going for an exact stencil. I'm actually going to just grab a little bit of turquoise now so I can change the color up a little. So just mixing that kind of mustard color with some turquoise. So that should get us a nice green. You can see that I'm limiting my palette somewhat. I haven't brought out every color under the sun because I feel like it's already going to be enough complexity for us to try and work with so many different energetic words without bringing in the whole spectrum of color at the same time. So I'm going to come up to this one here and bring in a little bit of stenciling texture with the green. So basically the colors I've chosen are in and around the greens, golds and blues. The antelope brown is kind of a greenish brown. And then of course the blacks and the whites for that real contrast in light and dark. Let's take a little bit up here as well. And I'm not going to do the same repetitive element on each one. So what I might do is just put that stencil down for now. But while I have the green still on my brush, as I said to you before, I'm going to use that. I'm going to take a little bit of white with the green, and I'm going to apply some of this heavy-bodied acrylic paint in different ways to several of these pieces, okay? So where is that contrasting? Why is it contrasting? Because so far we have transparent and we have line. We don't have any kind of opaque blocked in color just yet, okay? So there's another contrasting element for us to add to the piece. So what about if I just take this one, for example, which has straight line, straight line, straight line, curvy line, curvy line, curvy line, transparent, and then we just add in a block of opaque color. So suddenly you have a new element in your abstract piece. While I have the paint on my brush, take a little bit more white, and I'm going to look for another piece that needs something more opaque. So coming up here, we have a skipping line, and we have some kind of splat brush marks, which were quite random. So I'm going to connect those with an opaque circle. And I'm going to leave a little peek through to the underneath. So can you see what I'm doing? I'm just looking for ways in which I can add contrast, a contrasting element to whatever is already on the piece. Still have some on my brush, so I'm going to come over. This one especially feels like it needs a little something. So I'm going to take a little bit more of the turquoise and let's do kind of a cradle here, like a U shape that's cradling the other elements. That. And then just to kind of get rid of the rest of the paint that's on this brush, I'm just going to come in here and just add a couple of elements. Just basically take the paint off the brush. Now when you're adding an opaque color, one of the other things that you can do, which I love to do, is to take your bamboo skewer again and to just scratch through and bring an element of graffiti into the work. So this one has curvy line, curvy line, curvy line, and then I'm going to bring some straight, small straight lines scratched into that lighter opaque paint. And then scrape that white paint off and continue that repetition of that line down into the other color. All right, these are starting to look good. So I'm going to pick up one tool, and sometimes that's also a strategy, so that if you're starting to get overwhelmed with the piece that you're working on, pick up a tool and then let's see where we can actually use that tool using our contrasting list. So this one is one of those gouache play color art sticks, and this one is kind of a turquoise color. And so just opening it up, I'm going to have a look around and just see where can I actually play with this color. So first up, looking at this piece right here, I feel like it has a lot of curvy or swirly or undulating, and it doesn't yet have a lot of straight. So I'm just going to come right over the top and just bring in some small straight strokes. So just one move at a time. So I'm going to look further along and just see where I can bring in some more of the same element, but in a different way. So this piece right down the bottom here feels like it just doesn't have a lot going on yet, okay? It's fairly blocky. It's just one transparent blocked area and one scraped charcoal blocked area. So I'm going to take the line for a little walk around, connecting those two areas. Okay, so there's a curvy linear element now introduced, which is different than everything else that was on that piece. This one here, I feel like this would give us a nice contrast just in the color between this beautiful gold with the background of the antelope brown. So I'm thinking, you know, maybe just, we already have this kind of motion going on. Maybe this one gets several straight lines all the way through it, okay? Just looking around a little bit more. This one feels quite contrived. It feels like, you know, I have these thick lines, thick straight lines going up and down. There's a dotted line which was just a drip of the ink from above, and then there's this jumping. I feel like there's nothing on here that is scribbly or accidental, so I'm just going to come straight in and just scribble on this piece. Okay, feels really good when you scribble. Okay, this piece here doesn't have a lot going on either. It feels like there's two disjointed areas, so maybe, let's see, just join them up with a line. And then this one here, just going to bring in some circular elements. And then maybe on this one, a repetition of the circle, but using a different material. So repetition is also another important element of an abstract piece. Now, when we're looking at contrast in our abstract works, I want you to never be afraid to make a bold move, a bold choice, okay? Because sometimes those are the leaps of faith that will just take you into another whole arena with your work. So even if you feel attached to something, even if you feel like something is really working, sometimes it's a good idea to just like do something completely different, to just like change it up, change the energy up. So I'm just kind of looking at my palette here, and I have this beautiful Lush Midnight Blue acrylic paint, and I haven't yet used my finger as a tool. So I'm going to actually come in and just bring in some really large contrasting areas on some of these pieces, just using my finger and changing the energy up completely. Don't be afraid of really pushing the darks, because you can always bring light back over the top of the dark, and sometimes that's where you'll find a lot of oomph and a lot of contrast. Try not to judge the work as you're creating it. When you're making your pieces, they're exactly that. They are a work in progress. They're not actually meant to be judged. It's time to kind of judge them at the end. That's when you're going to be making the decisions about what you might need to add or take away in order to call the piece finished. But the process of it is not the time to actually be judging it. Pay attention to the energy that you're actually feeling when you're creating as well. So if you get to a point where you're feeling frustrated or you're feeling unsure, that's probably a good time to walk away. What would be the opposite of frustrated or unsure? So the opposite of being unsure would be to have more clarity. So sometimes what you need to have more clarity is perhaps a break, or a cup of tea, or to go and sit outside in nature, or go for a little walk, then to be able to come back in with fresh eyes and clarity to make the next move. So I'm going to have a little break, have a cup of tea, because I'm just feeling a little bit unsure about the next move. And there's always, of course, a lot more pressure on me when I'm actually trying to teach you something. It's like, well, hopefully the method behind the madness is coming through. So I'm just going to head outside, have a little break, and then come back in. The standing back and kind of looking and assessing is also a part of the process. So give yourself time to do that as well. It's interesting working in this way. As I mentioned before, usually I would do this whole demonstration on one sheet. And I'm noticing that having so many smaller pieces it's a whole different kettle of fish. It's a little trickier because my mind is like trying to solve multiple things, so which is fine. But what I'm going to do is just step back for a moment, and then I'm going to have a look at which pieces I feel are actually looking like they are more successful, even though we're not needing to actually have, you know, a complete successful piece. We are just playing around with these ideas of embracing the contrast. It's nice to actually be able to look at together which pieces are working and which pieces would need more work if we were to push forward with them. So what I want to do right now is just stop where we are, and I'm going to use a tool that I love to use to explore whether a composition is working or whether it needs to have something else added to it. So this is just a simple viewfinder made from two L shapes. And basically I use this on larger pieces as well. I'll use it around a canvas to see which parts are working well and which parts are not. And I'll use it on these smaller pieces as well to kind of give me some clarity about, you know, what is working as a successful composition. And I really feel like something with this one is actually working quite beautifully. And it could be that it doesn't need anything else. So I'm going to kind of refrain from adding to this one. The one next to it, this one here, I feel like it's definitely gone too heavy on the dark, and that I probably will need to come back over some of that dark with a little white. And how I do that will be a decision. Possibly I may come in with some white gel pen, some specific patterning, because everything that's on there right now feels fairly random except for the stenciling, but even that is not, it doesn't feel deliberate, it feels kind of accidental. So I may come in with just some kind of deliberate mark right in this piece here. This one I feel like definitely is lacking in contrast. Could definitely use a little more oomph in the dark. This one I feel like has a long way to go for me. Something simple about this one is appealing, and I'm enjoying all of the different elements and how they're working together. It doesn't feel like me, but that's okay. It's okay to stretch yourself as well and to do things that don't feel like you, just to kind of experiment and push your own boundaries. This one I'm actually really enjoying. I feel like for me it might need a little bit more contrast, so I'll look at that. This one, something doesn't feel right for me yet with this piece, nor that one. interesting about this one, I kind of don't mind the simplicity of that one. This one for me definitely needs something more. And this, more light needed in here, and definitely more in here as well. But again, you know, these are all personal decisions that I'm making about my own work. So, you know, coming back to this list can be a great way to just keep moving forward. So I think on a couple of them I mentioned that I would like to add in a little more contrast. Okay, so if we look at this one up here, I'm going to take just a piece of foam core. It's called scratch foam, but it's just basically, you can buy it from Dick Blick's or from art supply stores. It's basically a thin sheet of foam, and it's very much like the foam that you'll find on the bottom of a meat tray or the bottom of a pizza tray. And you can actually etch into the foam and create a pattern, and then dig a little deeper so that essentially you're making your own stamp. So I'm just going to add in a little element of pattern using the scratch foam, and at the same time I'm going to push the contrast in this little piece above here. And so we're just going to, I've painted some white paint onto the foam, and just going to push that paint down and then pull it off, and you'll see this little kind of pattern contrast, beautiful contrast area happening there. So while I have that in my hand, I'm going to look for another opportunity to use it. While I have the turquoise on my brush, once again, I'm going to look for an opportunity to use that. It's actually been sitting in the water, and so it's now a mixture of heavy-bodied acrylic paint and water. And I'm just going to add a circular element to this piece and kind of enclose or unite some of the elements underneath. Bringing that watered down acrylic paint. And you know, there's nothing wrong with if you actually try something or make a move, as in this circular element, that you feel really works well, then try it somewhere else. Try it on another piece and see how it feels there. For me, adding that kind of oval circular element to this piece actually works even better than this one. So I actually feel like it just really made this piece here. And it may be that this one is done. So I still have the paint on my brush. Let's try it one more time. So oftentimes you'll need to give yourself some space between one session and the next, especially when you're dealing with multiple pieces. So depending on how you're feeling, sometimes the best thing to do is to walk away. Often though, you'll have some paint left on your palette, and acrylic dries very quickly. So one of the things I like to do just at the end of a session, even if I'm not quite sure where some of the pieces are going, is I'll just add some white to my palette, and I'll just play with deliberately creating some more neutral colors by mixing some of the colors that are actually left on the palette. So I'm just bringing together a little bit of white, and a little bit of that kind of gold, Australian gold, a little bit of turquoise, and I'm going to play around with that colour almost as if I'm just creating some little swatches. But as you can see in doing that, I'm adding another element to the piece. Playing with the application, I could scrub. I could scribble. Coming back in, grabbing a slightly different mixture. Trying a different element. Adding a little bit of the midnight blue so we get some greys happening. Grey can be a beautiful unifying element of a piece. It's a beautiful grey-green happening there. Just adding in a little more white. This piece is getting slightly murky, so pushing that light. I'm coming in with a bold move over here, just to kind of change up the energy on this one because it really wasn't doing a lot for me. And I'm feeling a certain freedom with this white in my hand. So kind of coming through and adding that in some other areas also. White is often the very last element that I will add to a piece. Moving across my palette and really just using what is left on here to make some moves before I finish up this session for the day. So I'm really happy with how some of these small pieces are coming along. Some of them, again, feel more successful than others. I feel like I need to take a step back, have a break, and just come back into the studio again tomorrow with fresh eyes, and then, reassess where I feel pieces are balanced within those contrasting elements. I think it's important for me to let you know that when I talk about having a balance of contrasting elements, it doesn't mean having 50-50, like half dark, half light. There's always going to be more of one contrasting element than the other. If we think about the rule of thirds, then you're probably more likely to have 2/3 of the piece feeling dark and 1/3 feeling light. There's going to feel more of a balance within that than just having a straight half-half. Or another example would be to have a look at how many of the marks are bold marks and how many are delicate marks. If there was exactly half and half with bold and delicate, it probably wouldn't be as successful a piece as if there were more bold and less delicate, or more delicate and less bold. So yeah, let's leave it here, and we will come back to them, and I'm excited to see where we go next.